The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
I'm Leon Charney. I am talking to Dr. Carolyn Kissane, who was on the show about 8-9 months ago, and since then has traveled the planet, mainly Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all those oil countries. If you remember, she's proficient in the study of oil. She's a professor at NYU, and she knows about oil and hedge funds and oil. But let's talk about, first of all, where you've been since we saw you, and which countries?
I spent the summer in Kazakhstan. I was
Why?
there for 2 months on a research grant, an IREX grant, looking at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and civil society development.
Wow, say that slowly.
I was looking at oil and gas companies,
Right.
And the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in terms of how it is being implemented in Kazakhstan, which is a signatory to the EITI. So it's a global initiative to expand transparency in sectors that are known to be rather corrupt.
Transparency in which area? Give me an example of the area.
For example, Chevron Tengiz in Kazakhstan. So Chevron is a signatory to the EITI.
EITI is what?
Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It is an initiative that came out of the 2002 World Development Forum. Tony Blair actually sort of initiated it. Then the Publish What You Pay movement, which is
So what do they want to do? Get transparency out of oil companies?
End the government. So the idea is
The interrelationship between the two?
Correct, and to provide greater public oversight so that the oil and gas companies will publicize, will put forward their payments to the government. So very specifically how much they're paying to the government for contracts, also in terms of taxes that they're paying, and the government will then also take that
into their society? How to improve
Well, the
society?
ultimate idea, and that's what I was trying to look at, is the impact that it actually has on civil society.
Look how I picked up on that.
Very good, you're very sharp as always. I think one of the interesting things though in terms of Kazakhstan is you have a very active NGO coalition.
Non-government agency where Caroline is a real expert. We talked about that last time she was on the show, how non-government agencies sometimes get money to the people or to the citizens, hopefully better than the governments do.
Well, I mean, ultimately,
it's a very important issue, by the way, and most people don't know about it. So,
well, in oil-producing countries or natural resource-rich countries, this is an initiative that's just sort of helped to ease the high levels of corruption.
Now, could you do that in Saudi Arabia?
Yes and no, except for the fact that there's not an active non-governmental sector, and they tend to be less than transparent in.
No. Okay. So in order to be part of that group, you have to sign on to
Correct.
Agree to it.
It's a voluntary.
All right. How many countries have signed on to it?
I think there are about 10 at this point. Angola, Sudan is not. Nigeria is one.
Really?
Equatorial Guinea. But Equatorial Guinea is obviously not a very good case at the moment. But I mean, Kazakhstan actually is a standout because it has very active sort of NGO involvement.
Right.
Although the NGOs want further disaggregation of the data, of the income data, and the government and the private oil companies are not very enthusiastic.
Kazakhstan is very oil rich, correct?
Correct, yes.
So that's a lot of people don't know about that, but it's a pretty important thing that's going on in the world. So what they want, transparency of these oil companies who usually rape the countries that they take over. They pay little taxes, they bribe the officials normally. I'm not saying all of them, but a few of them. And then the public is very poor, and who feeds the public? Relief associations come in and feed them. So you can see the whole program going around.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So you went to Kazakhstan. Who else? Any other countries?
After that, I was in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, but it was
Wow.
a separate project. And most
Get
recently
frequent flyer miles for
most
that?
recently in Berlin, Germany. So frequent flyer miles, I'm working on them.
Why did you go to the other
Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Yeah.
It's a USAID funded project. It's an education reform project to increase community mobilization. Basically, it's linked to civil society and school governance. So I'm writing policy guidelines for the countries.
Okay, let's break that down. For those countries, you're writing policy in terms of what?
Well, it's the guidelines are directed towards the donors. So, for example,
For the NGOs, you mean?
USAID, Save the Children, Open Society Institute. So the participating
Okay,
partners.
so you're writing programs for these non-government agencies of how to fund their money in those places?
Not exactly. I'm working with another woman, Dana Birdie, who's up at Columbia, and we are responsible for helping to sort of address how to sustain the project. So beyond the termination of the funds, you know.
How bad is the oil industry in Kazakhstan?
It's actually, I would say it's better than a lot of other countries. I'd say that there's pretty.
Now, Carolyn, this week, if I say to you Chevron, Mobil, British Petroleum, and in your gut, is the visceral reaction negative about these
No.
countries? It's positive. It's positive?
Yes,
Do you
and
think they're basically fair?
They're not always fair, but I think that there are a number of different initiatives that are being launched. Many of them are involved in corporate social responsibility programs. They fund community development projects on the ground, which is something I was looking at in terms of Kazakhstan. They fund scholarships for their employees. So I think on a number of different levels, they are, they're doing very positive things in addition to, the exploration and the
Do
production of oil.
their PR people try to meet with you to influence you in any way when you write?
Not to influence me, no. No.
They take a dinner?
No.
Lunch? Early breakfast?
If I'm interviewing them, it's usually, at the.
Are they
at the
open to
location.
interviews?
It's sometimes hard. So you go through networks, different networks that I have on the ground. Mm-hmm.
All right, Kazakhstan is run in a democratic way.
Freedom House would say no. Freedom House would rank it as not free. I would probably consider it to be semi-authoritarian.
Who's the president?
Nursultan Nazarbayev.
Young guy?
I think he's in his early 70s. Very, very adept. He's a great diplomat. He knows how to sort of balance being courted by Russia, being courted by the United States, and also now very actively by China.
Yes, I would say Putin is dangerous. I mean, he's dangerous because he's not averse to risk. I think he feels very emboldened by many of the actions that he's been able to take, and the international community has not responded in a way that he's been fully ostracized. And I think he looks at what has happened in terms of, you also have to understand, I think, the Russian psyche. So the Russian psyche, that these sanctions hurt, but Putin is using them to his political advantage by galvanizing the population to say, look, this is what the West is trying to punish us for taking what is ours. We will fight back. We will stop eating Western food. We will stop buying Western products. So he's been able, I think, to use it at this point to his advantage. And I think he's got more support than many people would have imagined that he would have. So, and I think that you also have to think about Russians as survivors, that it's in their literature, it's in their national narrative that they survive. While others may fall, they survive. And this is, I think, another sort of chapter in that they have external outside enemies that don't understand Russia, that want to put Russia down, that want to usurp power from Russia. So this all sort of feeds into Putin's propaganda campaign to keep the population very much in line with what he wants to do. So, just last week he suggested that Kazakhstan was not a state, that it's a construction of a state, but not a sovereign, suggesting that it's not a sovereign state. So if you're President Nazarbayev, who's had a good relationship with Russia over the years, however, it does raise questions about what Russia's future intentions might be. It just might be, Putin being a bully and, sort of bullying Kazakhstan. But at the same time, I think it is to sort of tell Kazakhstan, in effect, tell other Central Asian states that, hey, you could be next.
Kazakhstan has a very interesting position as far as the Russians are concerned, in the sense of it is a Central Asian state, which immediately, from the Russians' point of view, means, well, it's not quite one of us. But on the other hand, it's been often a very strong ally, and its current ruler, Nursultan Nazarbayev, is seen as a relatively sort of effective figure from Moscow's point of view. But at the same time, from Moscow's point of view, in the long term, first of all, Kazakhstan is, as Putin said, not really a proper state, not least because northern Kazakhstan has a very substantial Russian population. And given Putin's sense that all Russians ought to be part of one single unitary state, in the long term, he feels that really they ought to be carrying Russian passports rather than Kazakh ones. The big issue, though, is what happens when Nazarbayev, who's getting on in years, either dies or tries to hand power over to a chosen successor. At the moment, Kazakhstan is really out of play, I think. But the point is, everyone knows that the crunch point will be coming. And if there is instability in Kazakhstan, if it looks that the Kazakh state is weak, then once again, Putin, the opportunist, may well feel that in some ways it's a time to kind of repeat the Crimean success in northern Kazakhstan. Of course, the big difference with Kazakhstan is China has interests there as well. There was no one really to help defend the Crimea for the Ukrainians. But on the other hand, the Chinese may well not be comfortable with seeing Kazakhstan chopped apart at Putin's whim. So that's definitely a flashpoint for the future.
I would say that the West has handled it in a mixed way, in the sense that I think they've been a little too easy on Russia. I think the fact that Russia did invade, did take Crimea basically without much of a significant response from the United States and from Europe. The fact that they got away with it is actually pretty extraordinary. And I think that in some ways that has only bolstered and emboldened Putin, the fact that he could actually get away with annexing Crimea, and the fact that he's been able to have troops on the ground in Ukraine, that is, it's been very beneficial to him at home. So his popularity rating is at an all-time high. So I think, if you see your people saying, good job, we really like what you're doing, it kind of gives that sort of energy to say, well, what's to stop him from doing more? So I think that the situation in Russia is such now that Putin is viewed as a very powerful leader, that he's resuscitated Russia from being on its knees after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. Yeltsin was an incredible embarrassment for Russia and for Russians, and Putin came in and he reinvigorated what Russians believe to be the rightful place as being a powerful country.
Putin made this move essentially out of opportunism rather than anything else. He, like pretty much any Russian, genuinely believes that Crimea ought to be part of Russia, that it was a historical mistake and a crime for it to be taken away from Russia. But essentially it's because with the fall of Yanukovych in Ukraine, the Ukrainian state near enough fell apart. And all of a sudden he spotted this extraordinarily tempting opportunity to basically take this peninsula with pretty much without a shot being fired. If Ukraine had been strong, if he'd felt that the Ukrainian military would have resisted, it's questionable whether he would have moved. But given that he saw an open door, he walked through it. Honestly, I think it's a mistake to think of the Crimean adventure as being pragmatic, as looking for sensible reasons. This is much more an emotional move. First of all, Putin does not really think that Ukraine is a real state. He's made that clear. As far as he's concerned, it's a historical accident created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that large parts of it really ought to be part of Russia. Secondly, Crimea itself, the population there were very unhappy with what they saw as years of misrule by Kiev. And above all, we now see a new Putin in power. In his first 2 terms as president, he talked the talk of the nationalists, but he was actually very intensely pragmatic. He understood that Russia's future lay in some kind of relationship with the West. Now, this term he's come back, and it seems that maybe he's thinking of legacy issues or whatever, but he's much more a believer in his own rhetoric. He believes the sort of nationalist nonsense that often is being put out by the Russian state media. And so from his point of view, Crimea ought to be part of Russia. If there's oil, if there's gas, if there's any other assets, well, that's a nice plus. To be honest, though, at the moment, Crimea is a massive drain on the Russian economy. But it's more that he felt it had to be taken because it ought to be part of Russia. He doesn't want to bring the Soviet Union back, though he's also said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. He's not trying to recreate the Tsarist Empire either. I think there's a new kind of imperialism that he represents, which is an ethnic Russian imperialism. What he really wants to do is make sure that all the areas where ethnic Russians who still hold to Russian culture are in a preponderance are back under the same state umbrella. So that means Crimea. That may mean parts of eastern Ukraine. That may in the future mean parts of northern Kazakhstan. So really, it's what he wants is a cultural unity rather than just simply expanding for the sake of expansion.
The new Russia idea, I think, sort of goes back to a 2005 article that was written by a Russian political scientist putting forward the idea of sovereign Russia. And the idea of sovereign Russia is that Russia will do what Russia wants to do, and that it will not be sort of be dictated to in terms of it doesn't have to follow the idea of a Western idea of democracy. So sovereign democracy in Russia means that, Putin can kind of do what he wants to do, which is what he's doing.
To understand how dangerous Putin is, it depends really what kind of danger. I do not believe we're heading for some world war. I don't even actually think we're really heading for a Cold War as a long, drawn-out confrontation between blocs, if nothing else because Russia is not that powerful. We have to remember, we're talking about a country whose economy is just larger than Italy's. This is not a major player. Yes, it has nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons, frankly, are not really usable unless your only aim is to turn the world into a smoking husk. Putin's real danger, the threat he poses, is in some ways because he forces us to make decisions. By his adventurism in Ukraine, he really raises the weaknesses of the modern international system. And if he gets away with it, then the real danger is that it encourages and empowers other countries, from Iran and North Korea all the way through to China, to think, actually maybe international law doesn't matter all that much. Actually, maybe we don't really need to worry about the UN or any of the other institutions that exist. So that's problem number one, is that actually by his actions, Putin is destabilizing a global system which has actually stood us in pretty good stead for a long time. Problem number two is precisely that Putin is now committed. He cannot afford to be seen to back down. So much of his political prestige is riding on his continued appearance as being the infallible ruler. He almost certainly wants peace in Ukraine now. I mean, it's very clear that the operation was expected to be a short-term one. He expected the Ukrainian government to fold very quickly and give him what he wanted, which is basically commitments that Ukraine would not become part of the European Union or NATO or even just move closer to them. That didn't happen. And so he's now stuck in this war that he's having to escalate constantly and paying significant price, not least with sanctions, as a result. But until he can basically go on Russian television and say mission accomplished, he can't afford to be seen to be backing down. So this is the problem. We actually have this very unstable actor. And there are still a lot of places where he can cause mischief, because that's his biggest weapon against the West. He can stir up trouble, whether it's in the Baltic states, whether it's giving Assad more weapons in Syria, whether it's seeking new agreements with Iran, with China, whether it's selling more weapons to Venezuela. He can do whatever is going to mess us up. And none of these are going to be existential threats, but they can certainly make our lives a lot more complex and make the world a lot more volatile a place.
The situation in Syria, I think, is one that's incredibly complicated and complex. So, as you know, Russia has supported the Assad regime and has supported the government of Syria. There was, Russia and China basically made sure that there was not going to be any action from the UN Security Council as two very, significant members. Will Russia get involved or be an obstacle to what the United States intends to do? I don't foresee that happening. But that said, I think that, one of the unfortunate aspects of the situation in Syria is that there's a very good chance that the Assad regime will remain in place. And so I guess you could say that Russia will, in effect, have won because Assad is not, if the United States has chosen to fight ISIS, and fighting ISIS means that they may not be putting the same pressure on Assad. So of the two evils, the lesser evil is the Assad regime. So there's a good chance, as I said, that if we see any kind of conclusive end to this in the next year or two, it's quite possible that the Assad government will remain in place as it is today. And that, I think, is a very sort of sad state of affairs, that, a government that has had, that has committed such atrocities against its own people. I mean, gross human rights violations, use of chemical weapons, genocide is, I think it's an embarrassment to the international community that he remains in power.
Chechnya is going to be a problem. Chechnya always has been a problem ever since it was conquered by the Tsarist Empire. The Chechens have been the most recalcitrant subjects of Moscow. And whenever they see the opportunity, they have risen up. Stalin ended up basically depopulating the Chechens and scattering them across Siberia and Kazakhstan. He was so worried about them, though in due course they were allowed to return. The bizarre situation at the moment is that the rise of Islamic State has in some ways acted as a sponge. It has pulled the young jihadists of Chechnya who want to fight for their cause off to fight elsewhere, to fight in Syria, to fight in Iraq. So in that respect, from the Russian point of view, it's been a good thing. We've actually seen a decrease in the number of terrorist attacks in Chechnya and in other parts of the North Caucasus in recent months, precisely because so many of the militants have been moving. The problem is that this is a short-term benefit. At the same time, the Russians are very worried because they know that at some point Islamic State will either win or lose. And one way or the other, the surviving Chechens will be coming home. And they'll be coming home not just with the experience and sort of the battle skills that they've learned, but quite possibly bringing friends with them. And therefore, although at the moment the rise of ISIS is politically convenient for the Kremlin, there's an awareness that actually the price to be paid is going to be an expensive one in due course.
So we'll take a break after that. We'll come back and we'll talk about how the oil reserves are in the world. Caroline knows. She follows it daily, I guess. Maybe hour for hour. I don't know. We'll call her. We'll ask.
Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or audible.com. Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers, or download the audiobook at audible.com or on iTunes. Discover The Mystery of the Kaddish.
We're back. We're talking with Carolyn Kissane, who is a professor at NYU. She is a doctor and an expert on oil.
The oil relationship between Russia and Ukraine, I would say it's more of a gas relationship. And Russia is, after the United States right now, the second greatest natural gas producer. And historically, Russia has exported gas through Ukraine to Europe. The European Union depends on its gas from Russia. 30% of European gas comes from Russia, and Ukraine is between Russia and Europe. So Ukraine has been the sort of transit site. And Ukraine has been subsidized by Russia, so they've not been paying market prices for Russian gas. And that's sort of part of, I think, one of the issues that's been going on right now is that Russia is saying, you want to look west, you want to join the European Union, well, you're going to have to pay market prices for your gas.
Ultimately, Ukraine has to cut a deal with Russia. Its economy depends on not just Russian oil and gas, but also its trade with Russia. And however much the West may be supportive in principle, it is not going to be keeping this tremendously weak economy afloat indefinitely. The problem is actually, how can that be done? Both Kiev and Moscow need and want to cut a deal. Neither of them, though, can afford to look as if they're the weak ones in the relationship. Putin has to be able to say, we carried out what we set out to do. And likewise, Poroshenko can't look as if he's actually now kowtowing to the Russians. So he also needs to have his face-saving formula. In the long term, there is the basis. I mean, Ukraine realistically cannot become a member of NATO for years. It just isn't at the state of military readiness to be a viable partner.
I don't know if it's a fear of the EU or if he sees it as an insult that a country such as Ukraine, that has had such a long relationship with Russia, it was part of the Soviet Union. Many Russians see that Ukraine is sort of a natural extension of Russia. So the idea that Ukraine would want to join the European Union, that would want to sort of switch sides, is seen as an offensive act for Putin, for Russia.
The European Union has no enthusiasm for Ukraine as a member. They're having enough trouble sort of bailing out economies like Greece's without taking one that frankly makes Greece look positively stable and well managed. In that respect then, actually, although the Ukraine can make the overtures it wants, it is not going to become part of Western Europe any day now. Likewise, another one of the requirements of Russia is that the Ukrainian political system be devolved slightly and become more of a regionalized one rather than with a really strong single president. Well, if we look at the fact that the last 20 years Ukraine's state-building project has failed, I mean, this is a state in appalling conditions, to a large extent precisely because a succession of strong presidents have also been corrupt, inefficient, or just downright stupid. This actually is a reform that will probably help Ukraine as a whole. So I think there is the basis, objectively, there is the basis for some kind of a deal which actually would satisfy Kiev and at least allow Putin to claim success. But we're still at the point where there are those within Kiev who think that potentially a military victory could be achieved, that actually the rebels could be tamed, though that's becoming increasingly less likely now there are actually Russian regulars on the ground. And likewise, Putin himself is concerned about the optics, is concerned about how it looks. He needs to make it look as if he's won. So until some way of squaring that circle is found, unfortunately, there will not be peace in Ukraine.
Poroshenko and Vladimir Putin, there's a chance that they may be able to negotiate some kind of understanding, some kind of an agreement. Not so much a business deal, but a deal that would, in effect, probably give Russia a little bit more power on the eastern side of Ukraine than it had pre-March 2014. But and at the same time, sort of give Ukraine the sort of the time and the resources that it needs to just get itself up. And I mean, Ukraine is very weak, and it was weak even before Russia got involved. So I think that, if you look at the job ahead of Poroshenko, it's he really needs to get the economy up. He needs to do a lot to address the rampant corruption inside of Ukraine.
Putin cares about the West, but he cares about them on his own terms. He doesn't care if the West likes him or not. I think that's one of the most crucial things to get through. But on the other hand, what he does care about is that he feels that for too long the West has not just neglected, but basically disparaged Russia. The West has done Russia down, and it's time, therefore, that Russia stood up. As far as he's concerned, what he's doing is simply redressing a balance. Now, we may well not agree with him, I certainly don't. But I think that's the way that he actually looks at Western perceptions as mattering. He doesn't care if you like them, but he wants the West to respect Russia, and he feels at the moment that the West doesn't.
Russia has experienced a lot of struggles over the centuries, and they've seemed to kind of overcome these struggles and these incursions in terms of outside powers. So, if you talk to a Russian about World War II, there's that historical memory of, we pushed the Germans back, like we were able to fight off the Germans, and they're very proud of those, of what they were able to do. They're very proud of their literature, their art, their history, their culture, and again, I just think Putin has been very effective at using all of this to his advantage in terms of feeding into the idea that, we can go it alone. We don't need the West.
The Russian mindset's an interesting one. It's always problematic when we're talking about the Russian mindset, any more than the British or the American mindset. We don't want to end up falling too much into cheap stereotypes. But that said, I think it is clear that the impact of the catastrophic collapse of the Soviet Union really has left a very strong mark on how Russians look at the world. Once upon a time, they were this great world-bestriding state, one of the two poles of the world. And then all of a sudden, they are an impoverished, has-been state, largely ignored by the rest of the world, and one in which actually weak political leadership seemed to be a dramatic problem. Boris Yeltsin, the first Russian president, was a disastrously bad president. He had no real vision for what he wanted to do, and as a result, for 99.whatever% of Russians, the 1990s were a very hard decade. And therefore now, I think they carry that through to thinking, better a strong state, a strong leader, than no leader at all. Secondly, they carry through with that a sense that they were had something stolen from them. A place in the world, respect, and respect meaning security as well. So in this respect, I think the Russian mindset is one that Putin has identified very effectively and plays to very effectively. We might joke about his theatrical appearances, his bare-chested antics, his pretenses to being this sort of one man who can fix the world's problems. But that plays very well, actually, in the Russian street, and it plays very well precisely because it plays to the mindset. On the other hand, though, it's not a mindset that it's easy for outsiders to really come to terms with properly. We've seen that with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was raised in East Germany, speaks Russian, has always been, in a way, Europe's most effective interlocutor with Putin. But even she has basically given up and has said that Putin is basically on another planet. And I think it's because, whatever her background, she's also the product of a deep democratic culture. and the fact that she's outgrown it. Putin, in some ways, has not outgrown his Soviet past. If anything, he's just changed it. And Putin is hankering after a Soviet Union that never was. All the best bits, the strength, the power, the perceived efficiency, without really caring about an ideology, without really caring about the fact that the Soviet Union was in fact a disastrous mess. So I think the problem is that whereas people who had some experience of the Soviet past have grown beyond it, Putin just simply has just romanticized it and uses that as one of his touchstones for the future.
I think that Putin has been very effective at putting forward designing a propaganda campaign that has made Russians think less of the West and think that the West is not superior, and that if the West is going to criticize Russia and take actions against Russia, that they will respond in kind by turning away from the West.
I think it's very clear that Putin has an extraordinarily low opinion of Obama and indeed the American political system and political elite as a whole. I found it interesting when the sanctions regime started, and I was talking to officials and academics who are close to advising officials and such like. Even ones who were broadly positive about the West felt that the West lacked any determination. They felt that all we have to do is just endure a few weeks, a few months, and then the West will fold. We'll come back and say, look, all this antagonism isn't working, let's have a new reset or something like that. And to a large extent, I think that is really down to the Obama administration. Rightly or wrongly, the Russians perceive it precisely as being a weak administration, one that is not willing to pay the price for tough decisions. And unfortunately, the former ambassador to Moscow, US Ambassador Mike McFaul, a highly rated academic and a very nice guy, but nonetheless, his attempts to build a new positive relationship with Moscow was regarded as a sign of weakness rather than anything else. So I think the problem is Putin basically does not think that Obama has what it takes to actually push the sanctions regime far enough that it won't just irritate but actually hurt. And the only way that the West can change his opinion is precisely by proving him wrong. But that will take time. And if at the moment he thinks that all he has to do is just wait for a while and the West will fold, then that encourages him precisely to keep on pushing.
Yeah, so many people ask the question in terms of, will the West go to war with Russia? I think we will have the type of war that we're having right now. We'll use sanctions, there'll be a war of words, there'll be a war of threats, but will we, the United States, put boots on the ground in Russia? The answer, in my opinion, is a definitive no. Will Europe put boots on the ground? Absolutely not. I think that, in many ways, it's, maybe it's partially as a result of the situation in the Middle East. You've got Syria and Iraq that are, under siege, and you've got a pretty new threat in terms of ISIS. And I just don't think we have the bandwidth to do much more in Russia in terms of militarily.
I think the West has made a dramatic error in trying to understand Putin for several reasons. First of all, they assume that it will be business as usual. They assume that third-term Putin will be the same as first and second-term Putin, without realizing that actually over time no one can be in power, in absolute power, in a state for so long and not change. Increasingly, he's isolated from many alternative voices. He only listens to people who are basically telling him what he wants to hear. The second way that the West miscalculated was when he had a very brief period as prime minister with his chosen protege Medvedev as president in name, if not really in power. The West thought, we can deal with Medvedev. Maybe he's going to be someone we can use against Putin. That very much turned Putin against them. And I think the third element that really is an area in which the West has misunderstood Putin is the extent to which he's willing to take risks. On one level, Putin is very risk averse. He only moves when he thinks he has a sure or pretty sure chance of success. But he is willing to go right up to the line. He is willing to basically call bluffs in a way that the West isn't. And I think that's one of the problems. The West thinks that Putin is going to be like them, going to be constrained by diplomatic niceties. Putin doesn't care about all that. Putin cares about power. And that is, I think, how we've really miscalculated in our dealings with Putin, is realizing actually what he's willing to do in the name of Russian national interest.
I think many analysts say that if he's not getting the pressure now, he will get the pressure if the sanctions continue and if they get deeper. So for example, in 2 to 3 months, if the sanctions go further than where they are right now, the most recent set of sanctions have more sort of specifically hit certain energy sectors and individuals and companies, state companies. And I think when the certain oligarchs start really getting hit, then I think that there will be, more pressure on Putin. I think right now we don't really know whether that pressure is being put on him internally in terms of inside of Russia. But again, many people say that it's going to happen because there's going to be a pretty dramatic impact.
Because it's very difficult to tell the difference, frankly, between business and politics in Russia, businessmen and politicians and vice versa. As the sanctions regime begins to hit, that's when I think they're going to start having some very tough conversations. And already, just from my conversations in Moscow, no one's willing to say yet, when will Putin have to go? But people are willing to hint and talk around that. And I think if we can look to a future where Putin does go, and I honestly believe that we may well see him fall before his next election in a few years' time, it will actually be not because he loses an election, but because somewhere in some opulent room behind the scenes, a great delegation of the great and the good, no, they're certainly not very good, the rulers of Russia, gather around him and say, we think you're an amazing ruler, you've saved Russia, it's time for you to make one last sacrifice in the name of Russia, and you've got to go. And essentially it'll be a backroom coup, the same way that Khrushchev fell in the Soviet Union, the same way Margaret Thatcher fell in Britain, that just suddenly realizing that the elite is united to get rid of you. We're not anywhere near there at this stage. But if the sanctions regime continues, and it has to be said that many people in Russia don't believe it will, but if the West maintains its determination, that is one of the ways that it really could actually have an impact.
We're back. I'm Leon Charney. We're talking with Carolyn Kissane. She is a doctor. She teaches at NYU Global Affairs, which is a pretty wide subject. What is global affairs, by the way, Carolyn?
Well, global affairs, the way that we think about it, it's, we have an energy and environment concentration, which is what I teach in. We also have humanitarian assistance and human rights, private sector concentration, as well as international relations and international law. So it very much sort of is modeled after international relations, international affairs programs. But
That's a big bundle there you got.
It's a lot, yes, but we have big ambitions.
We'll see you next week. We ran out of time with Carolyn.